whoever it might be. And so what happens in organizations, when we don't care and we don't humble ourselves to listen and pay attention, people stop sharing and people stop talking. Does that make sense? And so people quietly quit because we're not fostering an environment of belonging, right? It's working for some, but it's not working for others. And so as leaders, in my organization, I want people to know that I care. And there are some things that they might care deeply about, I might not be so excited about, but because I'm excited about people, because I care about people, you know, I make sure that I invest so that they know that we care as a company, as an organization. I want that kind of energy operating on my team. Because when that energy is operating on a team, what happens is you get a sense of belonging, and what belonging does, belonging leads to safety. In other words, another way to say that is trust. And if you look at the data, trust is at an all-time low across this country in organizations because of lack of heart, greed, lack of integrity. And so when trust is at an all-time low, you can't get the best out of your people. And so that's why humble leadership is so critical. Let me tell you about culture humility. So what we introduce at the school and what I help to talk about when I go into organizations and companies, I help them to implement a culture of humility. So what's happened with DEI, let me go here. What's happened with DEI is that everyone is focused on this through the lens of cultural competence. Cultural competence is how healthcare providers, is how many organizations have approached DEI. When you approach it through cultural competence, this is what happens. You make competence the goal. So what happens typically is you go through a training and they give you a bunch of stereotypes about a particular group. Then you leave and you say, well, I think I know about indigenous people. No, you don't. You just know all these generalities and stereotypes, right? No one culture is a monolith, right? So when we do it through the lens of cultural competence, we see culture as something that's frozen, and culture is not frozen. Culture is fluid. Who in here has kids? All right, so I'm not the only one. Okay. When you start having teenagers and so forth, man, culture moves so fast. I thought I was hip. My son said, Dad, we don't do that no more. That's out of style. I'm like, dang, you just told me this last week. It changes so fast. Culture's shifting all the time. And so with culture humility, this is what makes culture humility such a beautiful concept, framework, is that under culture competence, we see culture tied to group traits and labels, but under culture humility, we recognize that culture is unique to the person. When we begin to see that culture is unique to the person, now we can stop stereotyping. Does that make sense? So what that means is you can see two black guys here, but you have no idea how they might differentiate. That's why we have to move beyond race to really begin to see what people are bringing. You have to train yourself to not allow yourself to calculate what you think people are and what they're about in seconds. You have to slow down and say, I have to become more curious so that you can teach me what you value. And that's what we're preaching, to recognize that there are so many things that make us who we are, but we don't know how it is moving within a person. So let me use myself for example. I got 5 kids and I feel like I got 5 cultures. You know what I mean? They got the same mom, the same dad. This one likes this one hates this. And I got to learn him and how to be a dad to him, learn how to give him a little bit more. He don't need that, but he need a little bit more listening. He need a pop upside his head, right? You know what I mean? And so at home, you're doing DEI all the time. That's why it's got so complicated, and it shouldn't be. At home, you're like, hey, we got to stay on Timmy because Timmy is not going to clean his room. He's not going to take out the garbage, right? But Bob is very much responsible. So you give them different things because you love them, because you care. That's what this is about. And so there's a way to do this strategically so that it causes people to buy in and it doesn't become divisive, because you're asking people to connect at the heart level and to care again. Does that make sense? So in order to do culture humility, let me go back here for a second. There are three things. Number one, you have to be a lifelong learner. You want your culture to be a learning organization. And you have to engage in something that I call self-critique. A leader has to have self-awareness. In other words, you can't major in everybody else but minor in self. That's important. You really got to know thyself so that you know how you're showing up, okay? Number two, you got to begin to think about the power imbalances that exist. In other words, organizations sometimes suffer from this bias called groupthink, where we all like the same thing, we all go to the same place, and you don't get fresh perspective. And you got to think about how we're going to mitigate the power imbalances so that we can have people that push back, that challenge, to make sure that we're being effective and we're looking at it from all angles. And then number three, you got to have accountability. Without accountability, nothing's going to stick, okay? So, simple definition that I came up with in my research: culture humility is a humble approach to learning and listening that requires us to open our hearts to three things: self-reflection, curiosity, and empathy. If we can do that, we can really begin to go forward, okay? And then it also calls for us to recognize that there's value and richness in everybody, and that people have something to give us. So I always ask people this question. This is why humility is so important. If you're going to build something and build something really cool, which toolbox would you choose? Most of you would probably say toolbox B, or the one on the right, right? Now, for some of us in this room, we might not even know how to name or use all those tools. But it would be nice to have, right? The problem with toolbox A, there's a lot of different hammers in there. Not one's the same, but the problem is all you got is a hammer. And when all you have is a hammer, everything becomes a nail. And we have leaders like that because they lack humility. And the only thing they have is a hammer. What would happen if you were to open yourself up to new ideas, new cultures, new experiences, and you were to really embrace it? It would give you more tools. And the reason why this is so important is it allows people to shine in your organization. So you're going to get a book when you leave here, but in this book, I wrote this book based on this concept right here that I came up with, the culture humility wheel. At the center of that wheel is the idea of others over self. We live in a very narcissistic society, and we got to get back to, what is servant leadership? It can't just be about me, okay? And we got to preach that. And